The neon signs above Oakwood Tavern flickered dimly as Charlie pulled his old truck into the gravel lot. A week back from his third deployment, he wasn't looking for anything flashy, just a quiet place to relax before the responsibilities of civilian life kicked in again. The bar wasn't much, just a small spot off Highway 74 where truckers and locals gathered. It was the kind of place where you could disappear into the shadows, and that's exactly what he wanted. Charlie stepped out of his truck, the night air cool against his skin. His uniform was faded, its edges worn from months of use, though his boots were scuffed and well-worn. He didn't mind the slight discomfort. It reminded him of the long stretches of desert sand, of the tension that came with every mission. Tonight, though, he was just a guy in a bar, trying to find a moment of peace. The door creaked open, and the soft hum of a jukebox playing Johnny Cash filled the air. The usual crowd was there, two old men arguing over a game of pool, a couple of guys at the bar laughing, and a few people sitting alone, quietly nursing their beers. Charlie chose a seat in the back corner, a place where he could have a clear view of the room but still fade into the background. He wasn't here to socialize, just to unwind. He ordered a glass of water, his fingers tapping absently on the table as his mind drifted home. He thought about his mother's cooking, his nephew's excited voice asking about his time overseas. The thought of home was a quiet comfort, something he could look forward to after months of chaos. But for now, he just wanted to enjoy the silence. Then the door swung open with a bang, and in walked a group of 6 men. They wore leather jackets with patches that told stories of their time in service. Veterans, no doubt. The sound of their boots thumping on the wooden floor seemed louder than it should have been. The men were boisterous, laughing and slapping each other on the back as they made their way to the bar. Charlie didn't pay them much mind. He wasn't here to make friends, just to be left alone. But the leader of the group, a big guy with a graying beard and hard eyes, caught sight of Charlie as he made his way through the room. The man froze mid-laugh, then muttered something to the others. Their chatter dropped to a low murmur, and Charlie felt the sudden shift in the room. The tension was palpable now. He could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't acknowledge them. His calm demeanor was a defense mechanism he'd perfected over the years. He wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. The leader motioned for the group to follow him, and soon they were at Charlie's table. Their footsteps echoed through the now quiet bar. Charlie stayed relaxed, watching the group's movements from the corner of his eye. The air seemed to grow heavier with each step they took, as if everyone in the room was holding their breath. "Nice uniform you got there," the leader barked, stopping a few feet from Charlie's table. His voice was gruff, rough like gravel. "Where'd you get it? Halloween store?" The men behind him chuckled. The laughter was thick with mockery, but Charlie didn't flinch. He met the man's gaze steadily, feeling the heat of their scrutiny. "It's mine," Charlie replied evenly, his voice calm. "Earned it." The leader raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a smirk. "Earned it? That's funny, because I've seen a lot of real soldiers, and none of them wear sneakers with their fatigues. You trying to play dress up for sympathy, or maybe a free drink?" Charlie's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't bite. "I don't need sympathy or free drinks. I'm just here to enjoy my evening." The leader's smirk grew sharper, his voice dropping to a sneer. "You don't look like any soldier I've ever seen. Where's your boots? Your tags? Hell, you probably don't even know how to salute properly." Charlie stayed quiet, his mind steady, focusing on the jukebox in the corner. He'd heard worse. He had learned long ago to pick his battles. But something about this encounter felt different. The way the man spoke, the way the others laughed, it was a little too much. He could feel his anger starting to simmer just below the surface. The leader's laugh hung in the air, thick and mocking. Charlie didn't respond right away, his eyes scanning the group of men as they gathered around his table. The leader's crew seemed to fall in behind him, their eyes now fixed on Charlie, their posture shifting from casual to something more predatory. It was clear they were sizing him up, wondering if he was worth the trouble or just another poser. Charlie stayed silent, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of his glass. He wasn't here for a confrontation, but that didn't mean he would back down if they kept pushing. His years in service had taught him how to remain composed under pressure, how to maintain control when others wanted to provoke a fight. But even with all his training, the atmosphere in the bar began to feel heavier. The jukebox, once a comforting hum in the background, seemed to fade into the distance. It was just him and the men now, the rest of the bar seemingly holding its breath. The leader of the group stepped closer, his voice low, just loud enough for Charlie to hear. "What? You think you can just waltz in here wearing that and expect people to believe you've seen real combat?" Charlie didn't flinch, but the words stung more than he wanted to admit. The leader leaned in even closer, his presence looming over the table now, his breath sour with beer. "You don't look like someone who's earned their stripes. You look like someone who's just trying to play the part. You don't belong here." Charlie felt a flicker of something, anger maybe, but he suppressed it quickly, keeping his face neutral. He'd been through worse than this, and he wasn't about to let a bunch of loudmouths push his buttons. One of the men behind the leader snickered. "Bet he couldn't tell us the first thing about basic training," another added, his voice dripping with mockery. "Probably never seen a battlefield in his life." The laughter that followed felt like a slap in the face. Charlie's fist tightened under the table, but he didn't rise to the bait. He wasn't here for their approval, and he didn't need to prove anything. "I don't need to prove anything to you," Charlie said, his voice calm but firm. The leader's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Charlie thought he might back off. But then the man's expression darkened, and he leaned in even closer, his voice almost a growl. "You think you're some kind of hero? Walking in here like you own the place? I don't think you belong here, soldier." Charlie's posture remained relaxed, but inside, a storm was brewing. He had dealt with this kind of thing before. People questioning his service, questioning his worth. But there was something about the way this man was pushing, the way he was testing him, that felt different. The silence in the bar thickened. Even the regulars at the bar had stopped talking, their eyes flicking nervously between the group of veterans and Charlie. The bartender paused mid-pour, waiting to see what would happen next. Charlie met the leader's gaze without flinching. "I've served 3 tours overseas," he said, his voice steady. "I don't need your approval to belong anywhere." The leader hesitated, clearly thrown off by the calmness in Charlie's voice. For a moment, the tension seemed to deflate, but only for a moment. The veteran's pride wouldn't let him back down. "Prove it," the leader sneered. "Show us your tags, otherwise you're just a liar." Charlie could feel the room's collective breath hold, every pair of eyes on him now. The men behind the leader looked uneasy, glancing at each other as the confrontation escalated. Charlie didn't flinch, didn't move. He was done with their games. "I don't owe you proof," Charlie said coolly, his eyes locked on the leader's. "But if you think starting something here is a good idea, I'd suggest you think again." The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension so thick it could have been cut with a knife. For a second, Charlie thought the man might back down, but then the leader's lips curled into a snarl. "You've got a smart mouth," he growled, stepping closer still. "Let's see if your fists are as quick as your tongue." Before Charlie could react, the leader lunged at him. It wasn't a graceful move, more of an angry, desperate grab for control. Charlie's reflexes kicked in, years of training coming to the forefront. He sidestepped the leader's lunge, grabbing his wrist in a swift, fluid motion. With a twist of his body, he forced the man's arm behind his back, using his weight to push him forward and pin him face first against the edge of the table. The leader let out a strangled yelp of pain, his bravado crumbling in an instant. The bar was filled with gasps and murmurs, the other bikers frozen in shock. For a moment, no one moved. Charlie's voice cut through the stunned silence, his words controlled, but laced with authority. "I told you to think twice before starting something." He leaned in slightly, his grip firm but not excessive. "You don't know who you're messing with." The leader struggled against Charlie's hold, but it was no use. Charlie's calm, practiced movements had left no room for escape. The rest of the group remained still, their wide eyes locked on their immobilized leader. Across the room, one of the other bikers hesitantly stepped forward, his hands raised in a half-hearted attempt to intervene. "Hey man," he stammered, "let him go. He didn't mean nothing by it." Charlie glanced up, his gaze unwavering. "He came at me. You saw it." The bartender, still holding the phone in his hand, finally spoke up, his voice cautious. "Maybe it's time for you all to leave before this gets worse." The leader, Hank as one of the men called him, wasn't done yet. Even with his arm twisted behind his back and his face pressed against the edge of the table, he still snarled through gritted teeth. "Call the cops," he spat, his voice venomous. "This guy just assaulted me. He's wearing a fake uniform. I want him arrested." Charlie's grip tightened slightly, but not enough to hurt. He wasn't looking to escalate things further. He released Hank with a controlled shove, sending the burly man stumbling forward. Hank caught himself on the bar, clutching his wrist as he turned to glare at Charlie with pure malice. "You'll pay for this, soldier," Hank growled, his voice full of venom. The group behind him muttered in agreement, clearly rallying around their leader. One of them, a younger guy with a nervous twitch, pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "Yeah, we've got a guy here impersonating a soldier," the young man said, his voice shaking slightly, but loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "He just assaulted my friend. You need to send someone down here." Charlie stood still, his posture relaxed, but his mind was racing. He knew how this looked. It wasn't the first time someone had doubted his service or tried to push him into a corner. But this time, he had kept his cool. He hadn't overreacted, but he knew he needed to stay level-headed. The police were on their way and things could easily spiral out of control. The bar was alive with murmurs now. The patrons whispered among themselves, their eyes darting back and forth between Charlie and the group of bikers. Some looked uneasy, others seemed impressed by how easily Charlie had handled the situation. But no one stepped forward to challenge what had happened. It was as if they were all waiting for someone else to make the next move. The sound of sirens cut through the tension in the air, sharp and growing louder with each passing second. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows of the bar, casting shifting shadows across the worn wooden floor. The police had arrived. The doors swung open, and two officers stepped into the room. The first was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a short, military-style haircut. His face was unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. The second officer was a woman with sharp features and a calm, observant demeanor. Both of them immediately commanded attention, their presence filling the room with authority. "We got a call about an altercation," the male officer said, his voice steady and firm. He scanned the room briefly before his gaze landed on Hank, still clutching his wrist and glaring at Charlie. "Can someone explain what's going on here?" Hank wasted no time. He pointed an unsteady finger at Charlie. "That guy," he said, his voice shaky but filled with outrage. "He assaulted me. He's impersonating a soldier. Just look at him. He doesn't even have proper boots on." The officer's gaze shifted to Charlie, who had remained by his table, his arms crossed, his expression calm and neutral. "Is that true?" the officer asked, his tone neutral. Charlie shook his head slowly, meeting the officer's eyes. "No, sir. This man and his friends confronted me because they didn't believe I'm a real soldier. When he tried to grab me, I defended myself." The female officer stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room. Her voice was calm but authoritative. "Did anyone witness what happened?" she asked, looking from one patron to the next. The bartender, who had been quietly observing from behind the bar, spoke up. "I saw it," he said, his voice steady. "Hank went after him first. That soldier just reacted to protect himself. It wasn't an assault." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. One patron, a man sitting by the jukebox, added, "Yeah, Hank's been on edge ever since he walked in. He was looking for trouble." The officer nodded, taking in the room's response. He turned back to Charlie. "Do you have any proof of your service, sir?" Charlie gestured to his duffel bag on the floor beside his table. "In that bag," he said, his voice still steady, "I've got my service uniform, my ID, and my wallet. You're welcome to take a look." The officer moved toward the bag, carefully opening it. He pulled out the neatly folded uniform, inspecting the badges and insignias. After a brief moment, he turned to his partner, who nodded in quiet confirmation. "You're clear," the male officer said, his voice firm but respectful. "We appreciate your cooperation." Hank, still fuming, wasn't ready to back down. "You're just gonna take his word for it?" he sneered, his face twisted in disbelief. "He could have faked all that." The female officer shot Hank a sharp look. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "From what I've heard, you instigated this. And you're lucky he's not pressing charges for assault." Hank's eyes widened, his bravado evaporating in an instant. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. The other bikers, once so sure of their position, now shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. "This is how it's going to go," the male officer continued, his tone cold and authoritative. "We're filing a report on this incident. If you want to pursue your claims, you're welcome to do so, but you should know that false accusations are a serious matter." Hank glared at Charlie one last time, his pride bruised but his mouth shut for once. The officer stepped back, scanning the room one last time as the tension began to ease. The female officer turned to Charlie. "Thank you for keeping your cool," she said, her voice softer now, though still professional. "We'll make sure this is documented correctly." Charlie gave a small nod, his composure unwavering. "Thank you, officer," he said simply. The bikers began to shuffle toward the door, their earlier bravado replaced with awkward silence. Hank shot one final glare at Charlie before disappearing through the door, his group following behind him. The officers trailed after them, leaving the bar to return to its usual hum of conversation. Charlie sat back down at his table, his drink still untouched. The weight of the encounter lingered, but he felt a sense of relief that it hadn't escalated further. Around him, the other patrons whispered and stole glances in his direction, their earlier wariness now replaced by quiet respect. Charlie didn't need their approval, but he knew this moment, this small victory, meant something. The bar returned to its usual low hum of conversation as the door swung shut behind the last of the bikers. The air was still thick with tension, but it had shifted. Fewer eyes were on Charlie now, and the conversation felt lighter. The jukebox clicked back into action, the soft twang of country music filling the silence left behind by the confrontation. Charlie took a deep breath and let it out slowly, leaning back in his chair. It had been a long time since he'd felt that kind of hostility, the kind that makes you second-guess your place in the world. But it wasn't the first time, and he was certain it wouldn't be the last. The sting of being judged unfairly, of having his service questioned, wasn't new. The uniform he wore had always carried a weight, both literal and figurative, and sometimes that weight felt unbearable. Charlie sat there for a while, lost in thought, but not in a bad way. He hadn't let the encounter shake him. If anything, it had reminded him of something he'd known deep down. The world could be a place of ignorance, but it could also be a place for change. One moment, one conversation at a time. The bartender, a short man with a thick accent that made every word sound like a story, walked over to Charlie's table. His eyes were bright with a mix of curiosity and admiration. "You handled that better than most would have," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. Charlie nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Did what I had to do," the bartender grinned. "I don't know, man. I've seen a lot of folks come and go through this bar, but I ain't seen anyone like you." He looked around, his tone quieter now. "You're not from around here, are you?" Charlie's gaze lingered on the half-empty glass in front of him. "Number just passing through. A week ago, I got back from overseas." The bartender's face softened in understanding. "Makes sense. We don't get a lot of people like you around here, especially not ones who can stay cool when things get heated." He gave a half laugh. "Not many folks out here would have taken that kind of heat and walked away." Charlie's eyes flicked to the door. "I've learned a thing or two about staying calm," he said. "It comes with the job." The bartender nodded as if understanding a little more now. He patted the table once, like they were sharing some unspoken moment. "Well, we don't need no more trouble tonight," he muttered, then turned to make his way back to the bar. Charlie sat back and finished the last of his water, letting the coolness of it soothe his mind. Just as he was about to leave, the door swung open again. He tensed slightly, instinctively scanning the room. A motorcycle rolled into the gravel parking lot outside, and this time, it wasn't the loud, boisterous group of bikers from before. Charlie's gaze followed the figure as they dismounted, his mind flicking through the faces he'd seen earlier. The rider's posture was hesitant, careful, not like the others, who had walked in with all the confidence of men used to getting their way. It took a moment for Charlie to recognize him, but then it clicked. Bill, one of Hank's crew. Charlie's initial reaction was to brace himself for another confrontation, but Bill wasn't wearing the same brash attitude that had marked him earlier. Instead, the man approached cautiously, almost apologetically, like he was walking toward a stray dog he didn't want to spook. Bill hesitated for a moment before he spoke, his voice soft, almost uncertain. "Hey man," Bill said, his hands stuffed deep into his jacket pockets. "Can I, Can I talk to you for a second? Charlie didn't say anything immediately. His gaze moved over Bill's nervous posture, the way he stood there, almost looking for reassurance. Charlie leaned back slightly, arms folded, still unsure of what was coming next. "What is it?" Charlie asked, his voice even but watchful. Bill shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Look, I wanted to apologize," he said, his words coming out in a rush, "for what happened at the bar. I didn't stop Hank when I should have. He's got a way of riling people up, and I went along with it, but that doesn't make it right. I've been thinking about it all night, and I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Charlie studied Bill for a moment. The man's discomfort was clear, but so was the sincerity in his voice. This wasn't the same Bill who had stood there with a mocking grin just hours before. Charlie finally uncrossed his arms, leaning forward slightly. "Why now?" he asked, his tone still steady, but with a hint of curiosity. Bill looked down at his boots, then back up at Charlie. "I don't know. I saw how you handled yourself back there, and it made me realize how wrong we were. You didn't deserve that. None of it." Charlie's expression softened slightly, but he didn't give anything away. "You were part of it." Bill winced but nodded. "I know, and I'm sorry. I should have done more. I've seen a lot of hate in my life, and I don't want to be part of that anymore." There was a long pause. Charlie stared at Bill, thinking. He didn't know what to say at first. The apology was unexpected, but it didn't feel empty. Bill wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was owning up to something he'd done wrong. "I appreciate you coming here," Charlie said finally, his voice softer than before. "It doesn't erase what happened, but it's a start." Bill's face visibly relaxed. He nodded, the relief washing over him. "Thanks, man. Really, I mean it." He turned to walk back to his bike, and Charlie watched him go. There was a strange mix of emotions that swirled inside him. The apology coming from someone like Bill meant something, small but meaningful. In that moment, Charlie realized that maybe this was how things changed. Maybe it wasn't about big moments of victory or confrontation. Maybe it was just one person making a choice to do the right thing, one step at a time. Charlie stayed where he was for a moment longer, reflecting on the past few days. The world hadn't changed overnight, but maybe it didn't have to. Sometimes it was enough to stand your ground and let things unfold in their own time. Charlie watched as Bill roared out of the parking lot, the engine's growl fading into the night. He stood there for a long moment, letting the weight of the encounter sink in. It wasn't the resolution he'd expected, but in some ways it felt like more than enough. He finally turned back toward the bar, his thoughts still lingering on the apology Bill had given him. The truth was, Charlie didn't need validation from anyone. He didn't need anyone to prove his worth, but Bill had done something that made him reconsider. Maybe small acts of courage were just as important as big ones. Maybe one apology, one change of heart, could be the start of something better. The bartender gave him a nod as he entered, a silent acknowledgement of the tension that had passed. Charlie took a seat at the bar and ordered a drink, this time something stronger than water. He needed the burn, the way it would settle his nerves after the night's events. As the glass slid in front of him, he leaned back in his chair, letting his mind drift. He thought about the family waiting for him back home, the life he had left behind for the last few years, and how it felt to be back. He thought about the world he had fought in, and how he sometimes felt like he didn't belong here, among people who hadn't seen what he had seen. But tonight he realized, maybe belonging wasn't about fitting into someone else's expectations. Maybe it was about being true to yourself and letting your actions speak louder than your uniform. The bar had returned to its usual buzz, but Charlie felt a sense of calm that had eluded him earlier. It wasn't about the confrontation with Hank and his crew, or even the apology that followed. It was about something deeper, the realization that sometimes the most difficult battles were fought not on foreign soil, but right here, in the hearts and minds of the people around you. Charlie finished his drink and stood up, tossing a few bills onto the bar. He gave the bartender a nod. "Thanks," he said simply. He stepped out into the cool night air, the stars scattered above him like an old familiar map. Tomorrow would come, and he'd face it with the same strength he always had. No more questions, no more doubts, just forward.